In the previous lesson, we covered the difference between inductive and deductive arguments. In the rest of this unit and in the next, we're going to focus on logical tools for analyzing and evaluating deductive arguments. So in this part of the lesson, we're going to begin to distinguish the form of an argument from its content, look at arguments with the same and different forms, and focus on an understanding of what makes an argument valid or sound. Those are those first two key logical concepts we're going to introduce. You might remember that in the last lesson we looked at these two arguments on the same topic, the first inductive and the second deductive. So the first went, if the remnants of a hurricane hit New Jersey, there's a risk of flash flooding. The remnants of a hurricane will hit New Jersey, there will be a risk of flash flooding. And the second one went, when the remnants of hurricanes hit New Jersey, there is usually flash flooding. The remnants of a hurricane will hit New Jersey, there will be flash flooding in New Jersey. These two arguments were meant to illustrate the difference between deductive and inductive arguments. So remember, for inductive arguments, the truth of the premises makes the conclusion more likely to be true. That was the second argument. Whereas for deductive arguments, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So that was what was going on in that first argument. And what we learned from the fact that two arguments on the same topic can offer different degrees of support for their conclusions is that how the argument supports its conclusion depends on the form of the argument rather than its content. So it's the form that makes the first argument offer stronger support for its conclusion than the second, even though they're on roughly the same topic. So in using logic to evaluate arguments, our goal is going to be to analyze their form rather than their content. Now, the last pair of arguments we looked at had very similar content, but radically different forms. Here, we're going to look at two arguments with the same form, but very different content. So pay attention to the similar structure as I read these two arguments. Premise 1, if bristlecone pines grow in high-density forests, then they are highly susceptible to wildfires. Premise 2, bristlecone pines are not highly susceptible to wildfires. Conclusion, bristlecone pines do not grow in high-density forests. And the second one goes, Premise 1, if dogs bark, then cats bark. Cats don't bark. Conclude, dogs don't bark. In the first argument, the premises are true, the conclusion is true, and the conclusion, as you might find obvious, follows from those premises. The second argument is not so good, but in a particular way. The first premise is false, and so is the conclusion. But if the first premise were true, then the conclusion would have to follow from it. And that's because the argument form used in both of these examples is one such that if the premises are true, they guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So one of our main goals in the next few weeks will be to analyze the forms of arguments and show which ones guarantee the truth of their conclusions and which ones don't. And in doing so, we can evaluate whether a conclusion follows from a set of premises while abstracting away from the specific content of particular arguments, like these two different ones. So we can focus on the form that they have in common and ignore the content that makes them two different concrete arguments. So now we're going to introduce two key concepts we use to express the quality of deductive arguments: validity and soundness. An argument is deductively valid if and only if, whenever the premises are true, the conclusion is true. This definition should sound familiar from our definition of deductive arguments. So a deductive argument is one that is intended to be deductively valid. But as we'll see, sometimes arguments intended to be deductive fail to meet this standard. And when an argument is deductively valid, what we tend to say to capture that is that the conclusion follows from or is a logical consequence of the premises. Then in addition to validity, we also use the notion of soundness to evaluate deductive arguments. An argument is sound if and only if it is valid and all of the premises are true. So now we're going to take a moment to look at each of these concepts in a little more detail. First, validity has an opposite, invalidity, and it's important to be able to capture both. So invalidity is our concept for saying that a deductive argument is bad, that the form or structure of the argument is bad. An argument is invalid if it's not deductively valid. Another way of putting this is it's possible for all the premises to be true and yet for the conclusion to be false. So here's an example of an invalid argument. All dogs are mammals. Fluffy is a mammal, so Fluffy is a dog. Now here's how we can show that this argument is invalid, informally. We've got Fluffy on the right here. Fluffy is a mammal, so that makes that second premise true. And you should all know, it's true that all dogs are mammals. Both of those premises are true. But look at Fluffy again. Fluffy isn't a dog. So that should be enough to show that Fluffy being a dog doesn't follow from these two premises. All dogs are mammals, and Fluffy is a mammal, and yet Fluffy is a rabbit, not a dog. That means it's possible for us to describe some circumstances that make the premise statements true and the conclusion false. I also want to emphasize that it's the form of the argument that's bad. So even if it were true that Fluffy is a dog, we couldn't come to that conclusion on the basis of this argument. The form of this argument is such that those two premises can't support that conclusion. We can't draw that conclusion on the basis of those premises, no matter what the facts are about Fluffy. When we talk about validity, it's really important to remember that when we say an argument is deductively valid, the premises may in fact be false. But the argument is valid as long as it's the case that if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. Because validity and invalidity are about the form of the argument. So we imagine the premises were true. Then the conclusion would have to be true if the argument is valid. Another way of putting this is with valid arguments, it's necessary that the conclusion follow from its premises. So here's another example of an argument in a form we saw on earlier slides, where one of the premises is false, and that makes the conclusion come out false. First premise, if the stars are cold, then the astronauts can visit them. Stars are cold, therefore astronauts can visit the stars. For this deductively valid argument, the conclusion is false because one of the premises is false. But the key difference between validity and soundness is that validity is conditional. So it tells you, for any argument of that form, if the premises are or were true, the conclusion would also have to be true. But validity doesn't have anything to say about the content of the statements and whether they're true or false. It just tells us that if they were true, the conclusion would have to be true. One more thing. Since we know that this argument form is deductively valid, for the moment you'll have to take my word for it, And we know this conclusion is false. What should that tell us about the premises? It tells us that one of the premises must be false, because the only way you can get a false conclusion out of a valid argument form is by having one false premise. Let's now go to soundness. Remember, an argument is sound if and only if it is valid and all the premises are true. Remember that since all the premises are true, and by definition of validity, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true, a sound argument will always have a true conclusion. There's also our opposite, so we have validity and invalidity, and we have soundness and unsoundness. An argument is unsound if it's either invalid or it has at least one false premise. So there are two conditions for an argument to be sound. It has to be valid and its premises have to be true. And that means there are two ways that an argument can be unsound. It can either be invalid, regardless of the truth of the premises, or it can have at least one false premise. So the example argument on the previous slide we'll look at again here. This one was unsound because it had one false premise. Stars are cold, even though it was a valid argument. All invalid arguments, though, will be unsound. And that will be the case even if all the statements that make them up happen to be true. Because for invalid arguments, it just has to be possible for the premises to be true and the conclusion to be false. In this course, our focus will be on validity, since determining the truth of the premises is more of a factual matter. But when evaluating actual arguments, the key thing is soundness, since we care not just about the fact that whatever the premises are support the conclusion, we also want to know whether the conclusion is true, so we want to know whether the premises that support that conclusion are true. Note that validity and soundness are only properties of deductive arguments. Inductive arguments won't be deductively sound or valid. They just aren't intended to be. So in the latter half of the course, we'll focus on some formal tools for evaluating certain kinds of inductive arguments. And in this lesson, you've had to take my word for it that the arguments we've examined are valid or invalid. But in the next part of this lesson, we'll start regimenting our understanding of validity and the notion of logical form by taking a brief look at syllogistic logic.